Hello and welcome to my studio. I'm Jim Gloria, and today I'll be demonstrating the painting of a still life with daffodils in a vase on a Persian carpet. I'll be using oil paints, primarily Williamsburg brand, and some of my homemade media. Descriptions of my materials, how I prepare my canvas panels and make some of my own media will be the subject of another video. It all starts with my hand-refined linseed oil, which binds the pigments. From this, I make a gel medium and a marble dust medium as well. I use linseed oil if I want the paint thinner and more transparent. The gel medium also makes the paint transparent, but it keeps it thick. Marble dust medium, which I make using the gel medium with fine marble dust flour added, makes the paint thicker, translucent, and allows it to dry faster. I'll use different combinations of these media to change the dynamics of the paint to my liking. Now let's take a look at the work table. For brushes, I have 4 flats of various sizes, from 5/8 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch. You can use synthetic or bristle. I have some of each. Then there's vine charcoal to draw with, and a palette knife for making the IMPRIMATURA. In the center of my palette, I have the media that I just described. On the right, the gel medium. In the center, the marble dust medium. And on the left, a blend of titanium and zinc white that I've mixed with equal parts marble dust medium. This takes the edge off of the white, making it a little less harsh. I've got my 3 primary colors in the corners, and earth tones down left. Starting from the upper left and moving clockwise are cerulean blue, ultramarine blue, green earths, cadmium yellow deep, yellow ochre, red earth, Venetian red, burnt umber, raw umber, and Indian black. The next step is laying out the design. Once there's something committed to the surface, I'll be using what I know of drawing, color theory, and other skills to evaluate the progress and make changes. I go back and forth between these focused moments of seeing and painting and the critical evaluation of what I've done and what needs to happen next, all the while interacting with the painting in a silent dialogue. In this style of painting called alla prima in Italian, or all in one, I'm trying to capture the subject spontaneously in one sitting. I may be giving up a little bit of dimensional accuracy, but the painting will be imbued with a certain immediacy and liveliness. This starts with getting into the proper state of mind. I'm calm, quiet, and relaxed, in an almost meditative state. I'm letting my senses take in what is in front of me without judgment and letting it happen. My drawing starts with a few quick strokes of charcoal, creating rough proportions and placement. It's very intuitive. I find that works better for me than planning it out ahead. I respond to these gestures I've made to lay in the basic shapes, nudging things as needed. By starting softly with a light touch, I'm able to adjust things as needed. My shapes are defined by their value, or relative dark to lightness, in comparison to each other, independent of their color. I avoid focusing on silhouettes as it keeps me from seeing volumes of objects. I'll start first with the biggest shapes, ignoring details. Once the large relationships of shapes are established, I can move on to smaller forms. I try not to get lost in details independent of their effect on the whole. This idea that taking in the whole of a painting is different than, and more than, the sum of the parts is from my readings on Gestalt theory. Step back and take a look periodically to literally see the big picture. I find many of Gestalt principles helpful to my painting process and will be referring to them throughout this video. So I won't belabor the drawing. I will move on in order to keep the energy. The IMPRIMATURA, or first painting. The IMPRIMATURA fixes the value drawing with paint. It is typically done with burnt or raw umber as a neutral foundation. I'll also be using a touch of Indian black mixed in to get darker values. I like Indian black as it is warm and not as opaque. I'll use some gel medium as well to control the transparency. Again, my goal is to tell the story of the painting using minimal strokes efficiently. The palette knife will spread the paint quickly and simply. Just taking in the sensory experience and directly translating it to the canvas. I'm switching to a brush here to lay in some mid-tones using raw umber. This swirling, scrubbing technique, called scumbling, leaves a soft, textural surface. Now I'll start laying in the base color or local color. This is the color without highlights and shadows. I'm using a couple of different reds with burnt umber and blue mixed in to make the reds dynamic. Colors don't necessarily have to be bright, but I want some variation. The transparency helps allow the underpainting to come through. I think our brains get bored seeing uniform color. Note that I'm also periodically using the tip of my brush to make scraping marks. I'm using this as a kind of alternative to drawing. It allows me to remove paint and to create more specific marks where I need them. I'll also avoid developing one area too much before completing the rest. There is a reason for this having to do with how we perceive color. We don't actually perceive absolute color. We see colors only in relation to each other. Depending on which colors are adjacent, each color can appear to be darker or lighter, redder or bluer, and so on. Now it's time to move on to the next color. I'm using ultramarine blue and Indian black for the vase. By not defining the silhouette of the vase too specifically, I still keep the color loose and flowing. As I start the blue patterns in the carpet, the brushstrokes remain free and light, but not haphazard. I want to keep some semblance of the pattern without spelling it out too completely. There is a saying that the viewer's eye needs some work to do when taking in a painting. Gestalt theory calls this reification. Reification is an aspect of perception in which we perceive the object as being more complete than what is actually present. Reification suggests that we don't need to paint the complete outline or pattern in order for viewers to see it. So we fill in the gaps with what we think we should see. There is another related concept called closure, where our eye takes separate parts and fills in the missing information to create a whole. It fascinates me how little information we need to perceive a form. For instance, think of the famous yellow smiley face graphic. It's comprised of two dots and a curved line within a circle. With no other information, we immediately see a face. Unfortunately, this tendency of our brains to perceive things with minimal information works in reverse as well. It can override our ability to see what is in front of us, and instead use our stored image of the object from memory. These daffodils present such a problem. We've seen so many flowers and are sure we already know what they look like. We have to make sure to take a good look at the flowers before us and see them with fresh eyes. Again, paint what you see, not what you know. I'm using a range of cadmium yellow dark, yellow ochre, and a bit of blue as well to capture the greens of the shadows. I'll start with the middle value of yellow, later working in the shadows and highlights. At this point, I've laid in the colors of the main elements. I can now see how they relate to each other as a whole. I can see the overall feel of the entire painting emerging. It's early enough, however, to change things as needed. The location of shapes, where lines and forms meet the edges of the panel, how objects overlap in space. I'm evaluating my responses about these arrangements not by a set of compositional rules, but by how I respond viscerally. To me, compositional concepts are guideposts only. They make me aware of what is likely to happen, not what the end result will definitely be. They help me predict possibilities, but ultimately, some of the most powerful paintings break these rules. Some things I look for are which objects do I want to take prominence and which do I want to recede. In this case, I want the carpet to be in the background, so I need to avoid saturated colors and sharp contrasts. The yellow of the daffodils against the blue of the vase is inherently dramatic as their values and colors contrast. I may want to enhance this contrast or limit it. Now that the base colors are laid in, I start to work on shadows. By approaching this step on the painting as a whole, it will be more cohesive overall than if I had allowed one area to develop prematurely. I'm using bluer and deeper values of the local colors with ultramarine and burnt umber. If the reds get too bright, I can add some green to neutralize them. I experiment with other mixes as well. Painting is a learning process through experimentation. Successes and failures provide lessons for the next painting. You could say that I'm failing upward. Now I'm starting to work within the larger shapes to add detail. I still keep stepping back to take in the relationship of these smaller marks to the whole. One of the ways I achieve this is by what I call making a pirate face. Sounds funny, but I close one eye and squint with the other until the image is blurred. This tends to remove detail and simplify the relationships of color and value. Here I'm using the tip of the end of the brush, again, to scrape away highlights and smaller details. The vase has finely painted flowers on its surface. I don't want to make them overly specific. The scraping is a good way to suggest the finer shapes without resorting to a very fine brush. Now that most of the shadows are in, it's time to start working on the highlights. Up until this point, the colors have been mixed transparently to give the shadows depth. Highlights, on the other hand, necessarily use white in the mix. Since whites reflect the most light, they are the most opaque, hiding everything underneath. You can thin them with gel or oil, but they will tend to create a milky haze. Adding marble dust medium to colors won't make them lighter, but will make them more translucent and sometimes even more saturated. Also, when added to white, marble dust will speed up the drying time, even when used as an impasto, meaning thickly. So I'll be using the same tones as the local color, with white and some marble dust medium. These additions are also finer. I will be trying to capture the texture of the rough carpet weave. The narrow flat brush is perfect for creating the dashed lines of the threads. I'm also conscious of where these highlights meet dark values. Where the carpet meets the vase, the contrast between the light background and dark foreground draws the eye. A dilemma is that dark objects tend to recede into the background, while lights move forward. Since I want the light background to recede, I leave out details and increase the sharpness of highlights in the vase. This will locate objects in their desired place in 3 dimensions. Generally, I work from dark to light and from thinner paint to thicker paint. Sometimes this is called fat over lean. One of my teachers suggested that there were 3 things a painting should do: resemble the subject, look like light, and look like paint. Resembling the subject is easy to conceive, though may be more complex as we consider that we are not replicators, reproducing what we see in its entirety, but storytellers trying to persuade the viewer of the truth of our tale. As storytellers, we leave certain less interesting details out, exaggerate and embellish other aspects, and invent elements that help to make our account believable and engaging. As lights are added to the daffodils, I always consider what the source is, its direction and color. Are they warm or are they cool? Here I'm using cadmium dark. The lights need to agree with the shadows, with yellow ochre mixed with white. Once I discover the colors I'm using, I don't mix up a large batch and use it uniformly. Instead, I'll pick up each color individually on the brush and mix them on the canvas as I paint. The resulting colors are more interesting in their variation. That is the part that I think is meant by looking like paint. That is, there's no attempt to constrain the surface of the paint, to smooth it or blend it to imitate photographs or other media. The paint is allowed to flow and blend, rise and disappear as needed. I think of it as a magic trick. We know we're being fooled, but if the performer is adept and interesting, we sit back and enjoy it. I'll now begin laying in the fringe, using white toned with raw umber. It's easy to lose sight of the effects of lights and shadows on something so unruly, but if I follow the same steps as with the other forms, local color first, then shadows, then highlights, I'm sure to stay on the right track. I'm scraping away with the brush tip again, but this time I'm revealing the darks from the IMPRIMATURA that are underneath. Because of the way I prepare my gesso, I can paint over that first layer rather quickly without the colors mixing. This is one advantage to preparing panels yourself. You can choose to make them absorbent or resistant, textured or smooth, white or toned. Some of these techniques I use came about only after I started preparing more of my materials when I could. When I look at my earlier work, there is a progressive change in the look of my paintings as my techniques evolved in concert with the new materials. My professor Lloyd McNeil often spoke about how we should be careful to not allow the marketplace to define the tools and materials we use. Standard size papers and materials benefit the manufacturer, but they can constrain our range of possibilities. Another benefit is that I save a considerable amount of money too. There seems to be a premium on products marketed to artists. The same lamp, desk, plaster, clay, etc., has a heavy markup at the art supply store. In fact, I recall looking for plaster of Paris and was astonished at the cost at the national chains. When a friend suggested looking at the hardware store, I could purchase 10 times the amount of material for less money. I also buy my linen from a theatrical supply, where fabrics are sold in a much larger quantity and at a large discount. The marble dust I use I found at a pharmaceutical supplier. There's a reason the medium I make bears a resemblance to toothpaste. As I place the darks of the fringe, I'm aware of how they define the petals of the flowers. The negative space of the background will help pull the flower forward. At this point, I start to slow down and look for places that I think aren't doing what I want, or where there's visual confusion. Much like an editor, I'm nudging things around, adding color here, blurring things there, all in the service of the image. One thing I've noticed is that shadows can become flat if they lose transparency. Often this is the result of using a limited range of very dark values. It's something the camera and the prints made from them tend to do. The shadows even out. In fact, it is a giveaway to paintings that are direct copies of photographs. For if you're painting from a two-dimensional image, you're already losing a great deal of information. When working from a still life directly, we can use our powers of observation, which are much stronger than a sensor. Our paints are also more dynamic than a printer. Cameras have made us believe that life can be stopped and isolated in single frames. Yet we don't experience the world that way. A painting takes place over time. As we shift around, we see the subject from different angles and find new information. Our eyes adjust to the light of whatever we are looking at. If we focus on the shadow, we can see more depth. If we turn our gaze to the flower, the shadow flattens and we see more in the highlights. It's not that I don't love photography, I do. It's just that I recognize that they are distinct media, no more similar than a piano and an oboe. I laugh when people say, as a compliment, that a painting looks like a photograph. To do so is to miss the magic of what a painting achieves, in all its complexity, challenging the mind of the viewer. I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's my first try at documenting my painting process, and I hope to be making more on the materials and techniques of painting. You can explore more of my work on my website, www.jamesgloria.com, or contact me at art@jamesgloria.com with questions or comments. And be sure to sign up for my emails to learn more about my upcoming classes and workshops, exhibits, and more. And thank you for watching.